Hey, welcome back to Coffee with Scott. As you can see, we are not at Covenant Cafe today. Once again, we are at a different location, very similar to the location that we were at the other day, not actually too far from where we were the other day in the last video that we did. But I wanted to come quickly to you today and just throw something out, give you something to think about, something to maybe meditate on or ruminate on, or as some people would say, let it marinate in you. And that is something that I saw earlier this week, and it's kind of a different approach or a different take on a scripture, an account in the Old Testament that we are all familiar with, and it's in 1 Kings chapter 18, verses 42 through 46. And what it is right after Elijah has had the confrontation with the prophets of Baal, the prophets of uh, the King James is going to say the grove, but the actual word is Asherah. And so he's on Mount Carmel. The fire comes down, and this in itself would blow a person's mind. But the account tells us that the fire came down when Elijah prayed. It licked up the water. It consumed the sacrifice. It consumed the altar. And I guess what I have read past for years is that the fire even consumed the ashes. That just kind of blows my mind. Not that I believe that that's not something God would do. I had just missed that part or had forgotten about that part. So when I read it this week in that account, that just kind of excited me a little bit. But that's not what I'm wanting to really look at quickly today. And so, what we're going to look at today is where that is taking place. And so now Elijah is doubled over. His head is between his knees and he's praying. He's praying for the rain. And he sends his servant 7 times to look to see if there is any sign of rain. And so the servant goes these 7 times and he comes back, and most versions of the scriptures are going to say that he comes back and he sees a cloud the size of a man's hand. So this isn't very big. A man's hand, you would think, but I can stick there's a sign on this wall over here across from me. I can stick my hand up from here and cover that sign up. But if I was to walk up to that sign, and there's a phone number on this sign, my hand might cover one of the numbers of that phone number. So the cloud that Elijah's servant sees isn't the size. To him, it might be the size of a man's hand because he might have held his hand up to this cloud. But before I get ahead of myself, the Septuagint, that of course we have referenced several times on this channel, and we're going to look at the Septuagint deeper in the next couple of weeks at a couple of things, because I believe there is enough New Testament proof that we could make a statement about the Septuagint. But in the Septuagint, 1 Kings 18 and verse 44, this is how one of the versions of the Septuagint reads. It says, "The 7th time he said, Behold, a small cloud like the footprint of a man rises out of the sea." The Septuagint says a footprint. It doesn't say a hand. It doesn't say a small puff of smoke, but it says a footprint. Now think about that for a second. A footprint. A footprint is the sign of that someone is walking, that someone is approaching, that someone is moving forward. In this case, it's God's first visible sign of movement toward ending the drought. So you might go back and say, well, God's first sign is the fire coming down. That's not God's first sign of ending the drought. That's God's first sign of saying, I am the one and the only God. Because what was Elijah's prayer? Consume this, and I'm paraphrasing, but consume this sacrifice so that they might know that you are the God of Israel. But let's move on. So the servant comes back and he says, I see a cloud the size of a man's footprint. Another version is going to say the size of a man, the sole of a man's foot. So think about that for a second. A footprint. We've already said this. It's a sign of someone is approaching, someone's coming, something is moving forward. So when Elijah hears this, he immediately sends the message to Ahab, prepare your chariot. Why? Because God is stepping into the situation. I'm pausing because I want you to grasp hold of that. The servant tells Elijah, I see a cloud the size of the footprint of a man. And Elijah sends word to Ahab that says, prepare yourself. Because that sign, that cloud in the size of a man's footprint tells Elijah God's moving. God's fixing to end this drought. So God is stepping into the situation, and where he steps, hear me clearly, where God steps, life and abundance follow. And this imagery of a footprint, or God, let's say it this way, God's footprint. We can see this in other scriptures. I want to just give you two or three. In Nahum chapter 1 and verse 3, it says, the clouds are the dust of his feet. Clouds form the dust from where God is walking. So I don't know where you're at today. I'm in Mobile, and if you look up into the sky, there are large clouds, and these clouds are moving. And so when we see this imagery of these clouds or the dust of God's feet, I can look up into the sky today, and my mind will say that God is moving everywhere. It would say to me that God is moving in Mobile. God's walking in Mobile, Alabama. And to me, that's awesome, because we're just ending Mardi Gras, where they weren't worshiping God. They were worshiping a false God during Mardi Gras. And it was gray, and it was gloomy, and it was rainy. But Mardi Gras is over, and I look up into the sky and I see the dust from the feet of God. So where God walks, the atmosphere changes. And in Elijah's case, clouds rising from the sea meant rain was coming. Let's look at, and just give you another example quickly. We look at 2 Samuel chapter 5 and verse 24, and it says this, when you hear the sound of marching in the tops of the mulberry trees, advance quickly, for then the Lord, let's say it this way, for then Yahweh will go out before you. See, the approach of God can be heard before it's seen. Just like Elijah saw a footprint before the rain, David's army would hear a sound in the trees before God delivered victory. Footsteps, movement, marching, these are all signs that God is present and acting. I want you to consider that sometimes the approach of God is heard before it's seen. I know Orthodox rabbi, used to be the chief rabbi of Indonesia. And I would hear him very often because sometimes I would tune in to his radio show years ago, and very often he would say, "We hear the footsteps of Messiah." And coming from this approach, from what the Septuagint says, a footprint the size of a man's foot, the clouds being the dust from God's feet, the sound of marching in the mulberry trees. I kind of understand now what he meant when he would say, speaking of the Jewish people, that they hear the sound of the footsteps of Messiah. For the Jewish people, they haven't seen him yet in this generation, but they hear the footsteps of Messiah approaching. And you and I, we will often hear his footprints before we see him coming. Our third scripture I want us to look at is in Psalm 77, verses 18 and 19. And this is what the psalmist says. He said, "Your way was in the sea, your path in the great waters, and your footsteps were not known." Even when that's the end of that scripture. I'm sorry about that, starting in on this quickly, but even when we cannot see him directly, God's path leaves evidence. And I know many times I repeat myself, but I think sometimes it's necessary because I want you to grasp hold of this. And even now, I don't know if you can hear it or not, but the wind is blowing. The wind's blowing. But let me say this again. Even when we cannot see him directly, God's path leaves evidence. The waters, the storms, the shift in the atmosphere all mark where he moves. And when his footsteps appear, life and blessing flow. I want to repeat this part, that there is a shift in the atmosphere when he moves. The Septuagint reading of this cloud that Elijah's servant saw, you may think it's no big deal, that it's nothing, it's just a different version of the same scripture, but to me it's powerful. It reminds us that God's movement is visible even in small beginnings, a tiny cloud, a footprint. His footsteps bring provision, just like clouds form after his steps. Rain comes. And I've already said this several times, but sometimes we hear him before we see him. It could be a stirring in our spirit. It could be circumstances shifting or a sudden opportunity. So let me say this as we prepare to end. If you feel you're in a season of drought, whether spiritually, emotionally, or physically, don't panic. Don't place yourself in a situation of despair, but watch for the footprint of God. Watch for the footprint of God. Listen for the sound of his approach. Even though you may not see him, he's moving in your direction. He's moving in my direction. He's moving in our direction. He's moving toward our situation. And remember this, as you watch for that footprint, as you listen for that marching sound in the mulberries. If I remember correctly, even Nahum is going to say, you have your way in the whirlwind before he ever says the clouds or the dust of your footprints. No matter your situation, no matter my situation, I'm watching, I'm listening, I'm expecting, I'm anticipating the dust and the sound. And when he steps in, breakthrough follows. Elijah's servant said, I see a footprint. David heard marching in the treetops. Nahum saw clouds as dust from his feet. In your life, in our lives, God's first sign of movement may be subtle. As I've already said, a small cloud, a stirring in your heart, a soft whisper. But it signals, and I want you to catch this. Catch this. It signals a heavy rain is coming. When I think about what happened after the cloud, that footprint, I'm going to say it. I'm going to say it this way. After that footprint of God, that first initial footprint of God, the sky darkened. Not because God was absent, but because God was on the move and he was stepping and he knew what was needed for the people. It says that the wind blew, and I believe they heard thunders. And when I think about that, it takes me back to Mount Sinai as God is giving his law, his commandment for his people. And as he comes down on that mountain, there was fire, there was smoke, there was the sound of the shofar, but it's always also, not always, also recorded for us that there was thunders and there was lightning, there was wind blowing. That is God showing up, making his presence known. We're going to end with this, and I want you to remember this. Remember this. When God steps into your situation, abundance follows. When God steps into your situation, abundance follows. Watch for his footprint. Thank you for tuning in with coffee too, not with, but well, thank you for spending time with me and having some coffee with Scott. Thank you for joining me. If this video has been helpful to you, if it's encouraged you, if it's helped you, if it's inspired you, if it's given you hope, if it's giving you assurance, like the video. That's free. All of this is free. But liking the video helps the channel. Commenting on the video helps the channel. Share the video with somebody that might need to hear this. It might help somebody if you share it with them. It's all free. Doesn't cost a dime, but it helps. I don't make money off of it, but I'm not doing this for money. Help me out. Help me out. Most of all, thanks for tuning in and watching. We'll see you next time with Coffee with Scott at, who knows, maybe the same location, or maybe we'll be at Covenant Cafe.